So the first thing I will tell you is being an entrepreneur is not about having a tech company, and being an entrepreneur is not about getting outside investment. Being an entrepreneur is somebody who starts a business that is sustainable. If that business does not succeed, then you can try again, but what makes it a success is not funding, right? What makes it a success is that it's still around a few years later. And what I do now is what I love. It's leadership development, leadership coaching, and consulting. And I work with a lot of startup founders. So as I mentioned, I've been a Techstars mentor. I have just started my 18th cohort, so I've done it with quite a few different programs, but I've also done Mass Challenge and ATI and a few other of the major accelerators around. And I think the important thing that I think about in my work and what I wrote my book about is really how we as leaders actually can get in the way of our own businesses, how we as leaders end up creating the challenges for ourselves. There will always be external challenges, right? There's always going to be, hopefully not a pandemic, but there's always going to be market forces that come in and change. A competitor may come and shake things up. You may lose a key team member, something like that. But what are the things that you as a leader are doing that can make your business better or not? And at the foundation of all the work that I do is actually the reason why my book is called Turbulence, Leadership's Unsexy Solution to Rapid Growth. That is because nobody wants to do this. It's about communication, and nobody gives a crap. How many of you have had any communications classes here? Right? Name me a job where you don't have to communicate on some level. There is nothing. It is foundational for every work, but now think about being a leader. You have to communicate with your team. You have to communicate to investors. You may have to communicate to the media, right? You have to communicate when the shit hits the fan. You've got to communicate when good things happen. You're going to have to hire people. That's an interview. You're going to have to fire people. That's a nightmare. And yet, as leaders, this is something that nobody is training us for, nobody is talking about. And what happens is, unless you have the greatest instincts, or you've worked for someone who is a great communicator, and you learned by watching them, you're going to be out of luck. So, have you worked for someone who didn't let you know what they really needed? So expectations weren't set. That happens all the time. And you know what happens? Somebody gets fired and they're blindsided. Why? Because, well, I thought I explained it. Well, I told you what you needed to do. But just me telling you is not communication. Communication, by its very nature, the root of the word, is communing. Me standing here doing this is still a dialogue. It's not a monologue. If I see everybody falling asleep, that is telling me I'm boring as shit and I've got to do something else. That's my job, right? If we cannot be clear, how many politicians have gotten into trouble because they say things that are unclear? And there's too much room for, challenges or misinterpretations, or of course my favorite one that politicians use, I misspoke. So why is it that leaders are putting together great businesses, hiring amazing people, and then letting themselves down because they are not strengthening the major tool that they need in their toolkit to be successful? So I start my book talking about conversations, because that's the foundation, obviously, of every kind of communication. And the first type of conversation that I talk about is kind of weird, in that it's about the conversations we have with ourselves. Mindset is key if you want to start a business, for sure. What's the difference between an athlete who's talented and an athlete who excels? It's really ultimately mindset. There are people who have natural talent, and a lot of those people can get a long way, especially if they've got a great coach to help them get further. But what happens under pressure? Right? What happens when things get hard? Do they have the mindset to get themselves over that hurdle? If you read any books, if you see any interviews, if you've ever heard any athlete talk about what made them successful, ultimately what gets them through, or more their coaches tell them, it's their mindset. And the challenge is that we have conversations with ourselves every day, things that we believe or do not believe about ourselves. And those things can either propel us forward or hold us back. But what happens when that conversation is counterproductive to the team that we're trying to lead, or to the business that we're trying to grow? We don't think about how to have healthy internal conversations, or think about, even if something comes up and we have this kind of internal conversation which is not helpful, how do we shift that so that it is not detrimental to the people around us? And then we can start thinking about how we can have great conversations with other people. So again, hiring, performance reviews, which I hate that term, but they still use them, right? And these are all conversations you will have to have at any point in your job, because even if you are not the leader, you are being interviewed, right? That's still happening. Even though you are not the leader, you are in the middle of a performance review, which is just as much about you being able to communicate with me, your leader, to get as much out of it as you possibly can. Then I really talk about clarity. I'm just going to cover some of the high stuff around the book, and then we can just sit down and chat. I talk about clarity. This is one of the biggest challenges, because 9 times out of 10 people who are starting a business, there's a lot of unknowns, right? And that's got to be okay. But if you really don't know something, then you have to be honest that you don't know that, or you have to clarify that for yourself. Because if it is not clear to you, you can never make it clear to me. So many times we were talking about pitching like last night. So many times when I've seen pitches, I can tell exactly what is unclear still to the founder, because they cannot explain it in a way that makes sense. That's because there's something about it that they don't understand, or they don't yet believe. And that's a credibility killer for us as a leader. If I am supposed to be leading people, right, which means somebody is following me, and I don't know where I'm going, how far are they going to follow me? Then I really talk about credibility, which has a lot to do with us executive presence and how you show up. Everybody has a different style, and that's okay. But you also have to think about how your executive presence informs the people around you. If you want people to trust you, there has to be authenticity in that, and there has to be a sense of creating a conversation and a message through body language that's helpful. So if I'm sitting in a meeting, right, all kinds of stuff. Here I am, where's my phone? So I was working with a senior exec who's actually the CEO of the company, and he didn't know why his team was giving him so much grief. I went to a meeting, I sat in on a meeting, he spent the whole meeting, like everybody was sitting over here, he was back over here, and he was doing this. What was his body language saying? I don't give a shit about what happens in here. He waited till everybody was done, he stood up, he said what he needed to say, and he left. His body language communicated to everybody in that room, no matter what you say in here, I'm going to do what I want to do. Your opinions don't matter to me. I'm not going to connect with you. You can't get through to me. And then he wonders why people don't trust him. So much of that happens every day. You might have a guy who's a big, looming guy. I had a client who used to love, he's very, very tall. He loves to use his height. So we always had people sit. So if this was his desk, you know, he'd be sitting back here, he'd have somebody sit, and then he would always come around and do this. Getting in somebody's space, being very tall, looming over somebody, trying to scare people. That was his communication tool. But you gotta be aware of that because that's not gonna be effective, right? When I pointed that out to him, he didn't even realize he was doing it. He thought he was being more personable by getting close. I'm like, too close, too big, too much man spreading, not good. Then I talk about storytelling, which if there are classes around here on storytelling? It's in business, yeah?
Entrepreneurial leadership, that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, it's all storytelling, right? So an investor pitch is telling a story. You need to be able to tell a story to get people to come join your business, especially in the early stages when you can't bankroll as much. What happens when crisis hits? Crisis communication is nothing but storytelling. Sales is all about storytelling. And then if you're lucky, you're going to get media, and that's really about storytelling. And then you are the leader. You have to tell your story. That thought leadership thing that they call now, that's storytelling. So why would you want to be a leader and not learn these skills? Oops, I forgot to turn off my phone, sorry guys. And so one of the things that I find, I work with so many founders and I see so many people spending so many hours learning to do so many hard skill things. And some of them are important, but some of them you can hire for. You cannot hire somebody else to be a leader for you. You just can't. So what are you doing to be a better leader? And let's just talk about that term, right? Leadership. It's all there was no leadership classes. Stop. There were no leadership classes at Tufts when I came here. Nobody was talking about leadership and entrepreneurship. I didn't know I was an entrepreneur. I started businesses and all that sort of stuff. I didn't know what that was. But now they've got these leadership classes here. So what do you think that means? What do you think leadership is? What does it mean to be a leader? Yeah, somebody? Did you?
Yeah, I don't know, have other people believe in your vision. And like,
Absolutely, that's a
show
huge
that.
part of it, right? People have to be willing to follow you. Do you have to be a CEO of a company for people to follow you?
No. It's a good to do. You don't have to be the CEO, you can be whatever else, but
Right.
you have to be a CEO.
You might be, I will tell you, I've seen some very junior employees at a company be leaders. You will notice if there's somebody that everybody goes to ask a question, hey, Colin, do you know how to, you've done this, do you know how? If that same person keeps showing up like that, that person is a leader because that person is trusted. They're willing to follow people. I know many people in leadership roles, right? People with leadership responsibilities that nobody will follow. Nobody. I had a client who worked at a really big gaming company and she'd been really successful, but she kind of plateaued. And she wanted to stay internal and she kept applying for these internal, more senior positions. And she kept losing out. And she wanted to work with me to get over that. And so we were talking about the job and she said something like, well, they would let me bring my team. And I said, well, who would you want to bring? And she's like, oh, I wouldn't want to bring anybody. They're terrible. I wouldn't want to have anybody. I thought, well, they're your team. Why are they terrible, right? So if you're already their leader and they're terrible, then somewhere there. And then I said, how many of them would want to follow you? She said, well, I said I don't want them. I said, but that's not the point. You're going to find as you go through life, they're going to be great leaders that go to a company, and then great employees will always follow them. And they start having a group around them, a trusted group around them. Why? Because that person is a leader. Having a business doesn't make you a leader. Having a leadership responsibility doesn't make you a leader. Yeah, you gonna say something? Sorry. It's just the noise of the mask. I think this is so important because we think of now leadership as this definition. You see so much in the media about what it's supposed to be, what being an entrepreneur is. And what, you know, everybody wants to be a leader. What do you want to grow up to be? I want to be a leader. Well, that's nice. I mean, they started having conversations about leadership when my son was in 6th grade. I thought, damn it, give him a chance. Because in order to be a successful leader, you're going to have to spend time getting to know yourself and getting to understand how can I show up authentically, number one. How can I lead with my highest value? And how do I communicate that with every conversation that I have? Those are things you have to find out about yourself. It took me years to find out really where my highest value was. I kept trying to stick a square peg in a round hole. Nobody ever told me I was supposed to be trying to figure these things out about myself. I was supposed to get out and get a job, the right job, right? And you want to do well, and then you've got to do really well, and then somehow you're supposed to be hitting all these ridiculous milestones about when you reach a certain level, or when you buy a house, or when you get married, and when you have kids, and slug roll and all that stuff. And figure yourself out. Because great leadership is born when great leaders take the time to understand themselves, their own communication style, and become great communicators. Does that make sense? Does that sound trivial? Because this is the thing that I see, people leave it to the last minute until they're in a pickle, and then they want to get better at it. You guys are in this position where right now you're getting to know yourselves, you're able to do this kind of work. What if you start figuring these things out now? What kind of communicator am I? Where am I strongest communicator? Maybe you're really good at storytelling, but you're really bad at expectation setting. You gotta be good at both. Have a whole section on setting expectations, because if leaders only did that, if they were really good at setting clear expectations and making sure that they were understood on both sides, that would save so many people getting fired, or projects not coming in on time, or not done correctly, right? There's small things like this that can be so powerful. And then what is this? So you mentioned that this idea of wanting to be able to see ventures and what's good and what's not. What's good and what's not is back the jockey. If you want to eventually grow, let's say you wanted to start a VC firm, you want to really identify the smart, great leaders, because a great leader can execute on a great idea, right? Someone with a great idea may not be able to execute. I always say that vision without execution is hallucination, and there is a lot of that in the startup ecosystem. Big ideas, great ideas, no executions. Great leaders can execute because they build great teams. They make sure the teams have the tools that they need to do a job well. They are clear on expectations, strategic goals, strategic vision. They keep the trains moving on time, right? And people are willing to follow them even if something happens and things go off the rail. So if I were to start a VC firm, that's what I would be looking at. You want great ideas, yes, but you want to be backing that jockey in the early stages. VCs are really investing much later. So as an angel investor, that's always been. And the unfortunate thing for me is that I have often found great jockeys on their first outing that I invested in, and they didn't make the big money until the second one, right? So I lost mine on the first, made it back on the second, because sometimes that happens. But that's also part of leadership. Doesn't mean that you are necessarily leading an entire global division, right? You may be a thought leader, as they say, right? And people are following you and listening to you, and you are having an impact on the people around you. And that's what sometimes when people found a company, they forget. Every decision you make is affecting everybody else connected with your business. Every employee, every investor, every customer. And so if you can look at the leadership from that lens and being able to communicate effectively. I worked with a company, it was an Italian company, and they built this very, very cool tech which is basically you could play a musical instrument by wearing this glove. It's very cold for me to tech. And they decided to go the crowdfunding route. Well, they were having manufacturing challenges, and it was delayed and delayed. When I was working with them, I said, get ahead of this. Get the people who've already bought and are sitting there waiting with this deadline. The second you know that this is gonna be delayed, tell them. And if you know that this other company is already delaying their stuff, they're not manufacturing fast enough, they tell you it's gonna be here in October, tell the people who've invested in you that they'll get it in November, and that gives you another month. But by telling them the moment they knew, rather than 3 days before they were expecting it to arrive, they bought so much goodwill that one of those founders, who eventually left that company, now runs a company that helps other startups run their crowdfunding. Because he built such great relationships with his community, because he was transparent with them, he was communicating with them. And the lack of communication is the worst. People will always want to avoid a conversation that is uncomfortable. I don't want to fire you, so I'm going to avoid it until the last minute. And by the time, because I've avoided it and left it, by the time I actually fire you, I am seriously pissed. Right? That's not going to go well. I actually worked with a client who had to fire somebody who was not actually his direct report. Because the person who was his direct report, this is not great business practice, was actually related to the person who was being fired. So the boss had to fire this individual. And we talked through, how do you have this conversation with someone that you, A, don't want to have, especially when you are not their direct report, their direct supervisor. And we ended up figuring out how to have this conversation because this individual was miserable. They were not happy, and that's where this conversation started. I can tell you're not happy here. And he got her to start talking about that. And the conversation ended with, I will help you find another job. Well, that person became the biggest advocate for people working in the company that fired her. Why? Because they took the time to have the right conversation, the right moment. That is leadership. That person, that leader got so much respect from everybody else on their team. And even from the person who they fired who the next day sent them an email saying thank you. I'm not saying every time you fire somebody that's what's going to happen. But that is the power of effective and great communication when you are in leadership. Does that make sense? So what is it that you guys want to know? I don't want to sit here and yak about my book. You haven't read it. So it's hard to get into the weeds. We're a small group, so I'd rather just, what would make this time valuable for you with this idea, this framework of what I just talked about? Yeah?
Oh, I was just curious. I know you said like the very first bit of your book was about like conversations with yourself.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering like, is there like any one like insecurity or something that someone like, some sort of mindset thing that someone has with themselves that like really bleeds into how they interact with their team?
Well, yeah, there's a million of it. I mean, everything that we do, I don't get into therapy with my clients, but sometimes stuff does come up. You know, if you grew up with someone who is constantly telling you that you were never doing enough, it doesn't matter what you do. You can be 50 years old, and that's still going to be some tape in the back of your head if you don't deal with it. And that informs everything. And so you hear a lot of this term imposter syndrome, right? And really, there's a great definition in American Scientific, and I'll try and remember it, but it's basically, it is lack of belief in oneself, despite evidence to the contrary, right? It is, if you sit down and you look at the things factually, there's no thought that you have, no insecurity, which is really based in total fact. It's always a feeling Or somebody said something one time. Sometimes it just says, somebody that we respect says one thing one time, and bam, that tape is in our head, and then it keeps coming up in those critical moments when we have to make these decisions. I think the key to do is, when you have a thought, when there's something in your mindset that you feel is negative or is getting in your way, write it down. And ask yourself, what is the factual evidence I have to support this? I have two clients, co-founders of a company, one foreign, one American. Both have a situation where they had overbearing mothers who did nothing but tell them they were worthless. And they just they did their Series A for $11 million. And they struggled to get there because they didn't think they could do that. Because they were getting in their own way. Just their own thinking was getting in their own way, because in the back of their mind, their own internal narrative, their conversation with themselves is, there's no way they're ever gonna give us the money. And they were both having it. So it wasn't like one of them could pull the other one along. So what our internal narratives are that can be negative is, as long as any insecurities that come. I think the thing with those insecurities are those doubts that we have, and doubts are normal, and doubts are healthy. Doubts are your brain's way of saying, hey, slow down, let's look twice at this. But if you write it down, you're gonna know what is an insecurity that has no factual basis, or what is a doubt that you need to do a little bit more due diligence on. And just clearing that out of your head can shift your mindset. And I think that's really important. And then from there, you have to build a resilience mindset. How do you not only stop having the negative conversations, but how do you start having the positive conversations that get you through something difficult, something challenging, something overwhelming? I've had a client where when things got tough, his energy level, he would just be like a helium balloon that had just been let loose in a room. He freaked his team out. He was just flying around, and it was all frantic because his thoughts were frantic, so his energy was frantic, his body language was frantic, and it scared the crap out of his team. So you have to figure out, okay, I'm not judging that. That's the way his brain was wired. So if you know that about yourself, that when I get stressed, I get frantic, and when I get frantic, everybody knows, then what are the things that you can slow down? Well, you can't stop yourself from the psychological reaction to stress. That's the hardest thing to change. So you start with the outside in first. Start with body language. Catch yourself. So the first thing that we would do is, in those moments where he felt those stressful moments, he would go to his office. So at least he wasn't physically in the presence of the team to freak them out, right? He started doing meditation, which seemed to have some value for him, to just get him calming down. Once he started training his body to react differently in moments of stress, 3 years later when I saw him, he had a completely different way of adapting that. So in those moments of stress, he changed his internal narrative, which then changed his body language, which just changed the way everyone saw him. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, okay. What about somebody else? Yeah.
Yeah, so just moving to communication, I've been told that my communication style can be too direct and like too blunt in a way.
Right.
What should I make of that?
Okay, so that's what I would say, ask a question. What is too direct mean? So even if you take the word direct can just mean not passive aggressive.